There is an empire that most of the world has forgotten how to properly imagine. Not because it was small or insignificant or buried in obscurity, but because it was so vast, so long-lasting, and so deeply woven into the fabric of 3 continents that the modern world has simply lost the capacity to hold it whole in a single thought. This was not a flash of military brilliance that burned bright and disappeared in a generation. This was 600 years of continuous, evolving, adapting power. 600 years during which this single empire controlled the trade routes between East and West, held the keys to the Mediterranean, governed 30 modern nations simultaneously, and positioned itself, for centuries, as the undisputed center of the civilized world. We are talking about the Ottoman Empire. And here's the question that should stop you completely. How does a small, nomadic Turkish tribe wandering the borderlands of Anatolia in the 13th century build an empire that lasts longer than Rome, outlasts every European monarchy of its era, and leaves behind borders, conflicts, and unresolved tensions that still write the headlines of our newspapers every single day? The answer is not simple. It never is when 6 centuries of history are involved. Because the story of the Ottoman Empire is not just the story of conquest and expansion. It is the story of what happens when a civilization masters the art of absorbing everything it touches. When it learns to be Arab in Arab lands, Greek in Greek cities, and Persian in Persian courts, all while remaining at its absolute core, unmistakably itself. This is that story. And it begins with almost nothing. To understand what the Ottomans became, you first have to understand the world they were born into. Because the Ottoman Empire did not emerge from stability. It did not rise from a foundation of peace and organized succession. It clawed its way out of one of the most chaotic, violent, and politically fractured periods in the entire history of the Middle East and Mediterranean world. And that chaos, that extraordinary disorder, was precisely the condition that made everything possible. The 13th century had been catastrophic for the region in ways that are difficult to fully comprehend. The Mongol invasions had torn through Central Asia and the Middle East like a geological event, erasing cities, destroying irrigation systems, and dissolving political structures that had taken centuries to build. The Seljuk Turks, who had dominated Anatolia for generations, were finished as a coherent power. Their territory had fragmented into a mosaic of small, competing principalities, each one struggling to survive in the aftermath of the Mongol storm. To the west, the Byzantine Empire, the last living remnant of Rome, was gasping. 1,000 years old and exhausted, it had been permanently weakened by the catastrophic Fourth Crusade of 1204, when Western Christian armies had sacked Constantinople itself, the very city they were supposed to be protecting. The empire had never fully recovered. Its territory had shrunk to a handful of cities. Its treasury was empty. Its military was a shadow. Into this fractured, exhausted, leaderless landscape, a small Turkish tribe led by a man named Osman quietly began to expand. Osman I was not, by any conventional measure, a world historical figure waiting to happen. He was the leader of a small border principality in northwestern Anatolia, commanding a few thousand warriors, controlling a handful of towns, and operating in the shadow of far more powerful neighbors on every side. History, looking at him from the outside in 1299, would have given him no particular reason to expect immortality. And yet something in the way Osman operated, something in the particular combination of military pragmatism, religious legitimacy, and extraordinary tolerance for people of different faiths and backgrounds, began attracting followers at a rate that none of his rivals could match or explain. He offered something rare in that fractured, violent landscape. He offered a sense of direction. His sons and grandsons expanded what he had started, pushing westward into Byzantine territory with a patience and consistency that was almost methodical. They crossed into Europe. They took Adrianople, renaming it Edirne and making it their capital. They absorbed Bulgaria, Serbia, and large portions of Greece. The Byzantine Empire shrank and shrank until it was essentially just one city surrounded on all sides by Ottoman territory. And then in 1453, a 21-year-old sultan decided it was time. Mehmed II had been obsessed with Constantinople since childhood. He had studied its walls, its defenses, its geography, and its history with the focused intensity of someone who had already decided the outcome and was simply working backward to find the method. He commissioned the largest cannons ever built, specifically engineered to demolish walls that had protected the city for 1,000 years. He had ships dragged overland on greased logs to bypass the chain blocking the Golden Horn. And on the morning of May 29, 1453, after 53 days of siege, the walls of Constantinople finally broke. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting in the streets. 1,000 years of Roman succession ended not with a treaty or a negotiation, but with a sword in the mud of a dying city. Mehmed rode into Constantinople that afternoon and walked directly to the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom. He knelt on its marble floor, touched his forehead to the ground, and converted it into a mosque. Church bells that had rung for a millennium fell permanently silent. Europe received the news with a grief so total that chroniclers described entire cities weeping in the streets. The Ottoman Empire had just announced itself to the world, and the world would never be the same again. There are moments in history when a single human being and a single historical moment find each other with such perfect precision that what follows seems less like politics and more like destiny. Suleiman I ascended to the Ottoman throne in 1520 at the age of 26, inheriting an empire that was already the most powerful political entity in the known world. What he did with that inheritance over the next 46 years redefined what human civilization was capable of achieving when ambition, intelligence, and absolute power occupied the same body at the same time. He took the empire his ancestors had built through conquest and transformed it into something that conquest alone could never have created: a civilization. Militarily, Suleiman was without peer. He personally led 13 major military campaigns. He took Belgrade. He crushed the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526 so completely that the entire Kingdom of Hungary effectively ceased to exist as an independent state in a single afternoon. He besieged Vienna, the heart of the Habsburg Empire, pushing the boundaries of Ottoman power to their absolute furthest extent, deep into the continent of Europe. The Mediterranean became an Ottoman lake. His Admiral Barbarossa commanded a naval force so dominant that European powers paid tribute simply to be left alone. But here is what separated Suleiman from every other conqueror of his era. He was not only interested in taking territory, he was interested in building something worth keeping. His legal reforms were so comprehensive, so rational, and so far ahead of contemporary European legal thinking that his own people called him Kanuni, the lawgiver. He systematized Ottoman law into a coherent framework that balanced Islamic jurisprudence with practical governance in a way that had never been attempted at that scale before. Under his legal code, Christians and Jews living within the empire were not merely tolerated, they were protected. They paid different taxes. They maintained their own courts for personal matters. They practiced their faiths openly in an era when European Christians were burning each other at the stake over theological disagreements that most people today could not even articulate. Istanbul under Suleiman was the most cosmopolitan city on earth. Greeks, Armenians, Jews expelled from Spain, Arab scholars, Persian poets, Venetian merchants, and Slavic administrators all moved through its streets simultaneously, conducting business, practicing their faiths, and contributing to an urban culture of extraordinary sophistication and variety. And then there was Hurrem Sultan. Born somewhere in Eastern Europe, captured and brought to the imperial harem as a slave girl, she did something no woman in Ottoman history had ever done before. She made Suleiman love her so completely, so irrevocably, that he freed her, married her legally and publicly, and allowed her to become the most politically powerful woman in the empire's history. She corresponded with foreign kings. She commissioned mosques and charitable foundations. She navigated the lethal politics of the imperial court with an intelligence so sharp that her enemies could never quite find the angle to destroy her. In a system designed to keep women invisible, Hurrem Sultan became unforgettable. This was the Ottoman Empire at its absolute peak. An empire of 46 years under one man's vision, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the borders of Persia, from the Crimea to the Horn of Africa. An empire where the law protected the weak, where architecture reached toward heaven, where poetry was considered as serious a pursuit as warfare, and where the question of who you were mattered far less than what you could contribute. Suleiman died in 1566, on campaign in Hungary, in his tent, before he could see the battle he had come to fight. He had ruled for 46 years, and the empire he left behind him would spend the next 3.5 centuries slowly, painfully, and irreversibly forgetting everything he had understood. There is a pattern that runs through the collapse of every great empire in human history, and once you learn to see it, you cannot unsee it. It is never the external enemy that delivers the fatal blow. The external enemy only finishes what the internal rot has already started. The Mongols did not destroy a healthy Abbasid caliphate. They destroyed one that had already been hollowed out by decades of political dysfunction. The Persians did not take a strong Babylon. They walked into a city whose last king had abandoned it. And the forces that would eventually bring down the Ottoman Empire did not attack a civilization at the height of its power. They picked apart something that had already been quietly falling apart from the inside for generations. It began, as it so often does, with the question of who actually holds power. After Suleiman, the sultans who followed him were, with very few exceptions, dramatically less capable than the throne they inherited. The imperial harem, which under Hurrem Sultan had been a place of genuine political intelligence, became under lesser sultans a labyrinth of competing maternal ambitions, poisonings, and palace coups that historians would dryly label the Sultanate of Women. Mothers of sultans, sisters of sultans, and favorites of sultans pulled the strings of an empire that increasingly had no one coherent at its center. The Janissaries, the elite military corps that had been the unstoppable cutting edge of Ottoman expansion, gradually transformed into something else entirely. They became a political force. They made and unmade sultans. They rioted when their privileges were threatened. The military machine that had terrorized Europe became the empire's most dangerous internal enemy. And beyond the palace walls, the world was changing in ways that the Ottoman system was structurally incapable of keeping pace with. Europe was industrializing. Science was accelerating. Naval technology was shifting the balance of power away from land empires and toward Atlantic Ocean powers that the Ottomans had never needed to take seriously before. The empire that had once been the most modern political entity on Earth was standing still while the world it had dominated accelerated past it. The Eternal Empire was beginning to crack, and the fractures, once started, would prove impossible to stop. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Ottoman Empire had already been dying for 100 years. The 19th century had been a relentless series of territorial amputations, each one more humiliating than the last. Greece broke away. Serbia broke away. Bulgaria broke away. Egypt slipped out of real Ottoman control and into the orbit of the British Empire. The Russians pushed south with an appetite for warm water ports that the Ottomans could no longer resist. European powers had begun referring to the empire openly, contemptuously, as the sick man of Europe. A civilization that had once made Vienna tremble was now being kept alive primarily because the major European powers could not agree on how to divide its corpse without going to war with each other. And then they went to war with each other anyway. In 1914, when the First World War erupted across Europe, the Ottoman leadership made a decision that would prove to be the final, irreversible mistake of a 600-year-old empire. They chose a side. They aligned with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, calculating that a German victory would push back the Russian threat in the north and restore Ottoman prestige in a region where it had been declining for a century. It was a gamble built on desperation rather than strategy, and it failed in every dimension simultaneously. The war exposed every structural weakness the empire had spent a century accumulating. The military, once the most feared fighting force in the world, was undersupplied, poorly commanded, and fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously against enemies who were better equipped and, increasingly, better organized. The famous Gallipoli campaign of 1915, where Ottoman forces successfully repelled a massive Allied invasion, was the one bright moment in an otherwise unrelenting catastrophe. It produced a military hero named Mustafa Kemal, but even Gallipoli could not change the fundamental arithmetic of a war the Ottomans were losing everywhere else. Then came the blow from within. The Arab Revolt of 1916, orchestrated with British support and famously romanticized through the figure of T.E. Lawrence, turned Ottoman Arab subjects into active enemies behind Ottoman lines. The empire that had held together dozens of ethnic and religious communities for 6 centuries suddenly found those communities peeling away, one after another, choosing any future over an Ottoman one. In 1918, the war ended. Germany lost, and the Ottoman Empire, as a political entity, effectively ceased to exist. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 was not a peace agreement. It was a dismemberment. Allied powers carved up what remained of Ottoman territory with the casual confidence of men dividing an inheritance they felt entirely entitled to. The Arab Middle East was divided between Britain and France, along lines drawn with rulers and political convenience, with almost no reference to the people actually living there. Those lines, those casually drawn borders of 1920, are the borders that still generate wars, refugee crises, and geopolitical catastrophes in our newspapers today. But here is where the Ottoman story delivers its final, stunning reversal. Because out of the absolute wreckage of a defeated, dismembered, occupied empire, one man refused to accept that the story was over. Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, organized what remained of the Ottoman military and launched the Turkish War of Independence against the Allied occupation forces and the Greek army that had landed on Anatolian soil. 3 years of brutal fighting. And then, in 1923, something that the entire world had considered impossible. A new state emerged from the ruins of the oldest empire in the region, the Republic of Turkey. Secular, modern, and sovereign. The empire was gone, but the people who had built it were still here, still standing, still, against every reasonable expectation, refusing to disappear. Close your eyes and think about the modern Middle East. Think about the borders of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. Think about the tensions between them, the wars fought across them, the refugee crises generated by them, and the geopolitical catastrophes that have defined that entire region for the past 100 years. Now understand this. Every single one of those borders was drawn in the aftermath of Ottoman collapse. Every single one of those tensions has its roots in the moment when European powers sat down with maps and rulers and divided a 600-year-old civilization into pieces that suited their imperial interests, rather than the human realities on the ground. The Ottoman Empire did not just fall, it was cut apart. And the wounds from that cutting have never closed. Today, 30 modern nations sit on what was once Ottoman territory. Their languages, their legal traditions, their architectural heritage, their culinary cultures, and their religious institutions all carry the unmistakable fingerprints of 6 centuries of Ottoman governance. In Turkey itself, a complex and unresolved conversation about Ottoman identity continues to shape politics in ways that outside observers frequently misunderstand. When the Hagia Sophia was reconverted from a museum back into a mosque in 2020, the reaction it generated across the world was not about a building. It was about memory, about whose version of history gets to occupy the most contested square meters on Earth. The Ottoman Empire is gone. Its sultans are dust. Its Janissaries are history. Its fleets no longer command the Mediterranean, but its ghost writes the headlines every single day. In every unresolved border dispute, in every sectarian tension, in every conversation about what the modern Middle East should look like and who gets to decide, the Ottoman Empire is still in the room. 600 years of rule left behind one question the modern world is still trying to answer. Who gets to decide where one civilization ends and another begins?